Now we're going to speak about worship in the Old Testament, scene 1. Scene 1. Scene 1 takes place in the Garden of Eden. And this scene primarily is happening in Genesis chapters 1 through 3. We want to understand the nature of worship in Old Testament times. We have to begin at the beginning. As musicians say, let's start at the very beginning, a very good place to start. So everything begins with God. It starts with the star of our story. It starts with a God who is true and living. All true understanding begins with the truth that God alone is worthy of our worship. Everything else is a pretender to worship. We can't understand ourselves as created people until we understand God as our creator. We can't understand sin or evil until we understand the good to which it is opposed. So when we as believers declare that God is worthy, we're declaring that He defines our very existence. He is the aim of our lives. So let's start here. God initiates. God initiates. God takes the initiative at the very beginning of creation. By initiative, we mean God created in response to nothing. He began with nothing. The theological term here is ex nihilo. There was nothing before Him. There was nothing alongside of Him. He was all that existed. He created in response to nothing. He began with nothing, and then He made everything. He took something that was formless and void, and then He took what was formless and He formed it. He took what was void and empty and He filled it. He formed and He filled it. He did an amazing job. Here's an important word. He did a glorious job. Second, God initiates, God reveals. Through God's activity, He reveals who He is. God never does anything for no reason. All of His works are for a very good reason. He is infinitely wise, so He doesn't do anything incorrectly. Our God is in the heavens, Psalm 115 reminds us. He does all that He pleases. And the main thing that He does when He acts is He reveals Himself. He shows a watching world what He is like. God may be a spirit that's invisible to our physical eyes, but the Bible tells us that we can clearly perceive what it describes as His invisible attributes. I'm in Romans 1, in case you can't tell, where the Apostle Paul tells us that God's, quote, eternal power and divine nature are clearly evident to people in the things that have been made. The God who is worthy of our praise has gloriously revealed Himself in creation. And so, at the end of creation, in response to absolutely nothing, God took the initiative and made humans. Now, God initiates, God reveals, humanity responds. Because God has initiated, humanity has the responsibility to respond to what God has done and who God is. Because people can clearly perceive these attributes of God, they must respond appropriately to God's worthy character with worship, obedience, and love. So let's start here. I told you that there would be 3 sons in our story. The first son is Adam. Adam is the first son. Luke chapter 3, verse 38, at the end of Luke's genealogy, it says that Adam was the son of God. The Bible tells us that our first ancestors, Adam and Eve, were created to worship God, to glorify Him with perfect love and obedience, to declare His worthiness by ordering their lives around His glorious life. To perceive God's eternal power and His divine nature, to see what He is, to see who He is, and to see what He has done, and not to respond with worship is to sin. It is to sinfully proclaim that God is unworthy. And that's a lie. Nothing could be further from the truth. God is glorious and worthy. And so humans should respond with obedience. What did it mean for Adam and Eve to obey in the garden? Well, God commanded Adam to fast from one of the trees, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, in order that he might feast at another tree, the tree of life. He asked Adam to abstain from something and enjoy and receive as God's good gift these things. An obedient response, we might say true worship, would result in everlasting life, union and communion with a glorious and initiating God. And so here, even in the garden at the very beginning, we see what we're going to refer to as a threefold pattern of worship. We see that God initiates a call to worship through his commanding word. Second, God's people respond with love and obedience. That's worship. That is followed by 3, a fellowship meal of union and communion with God. But as you know, Adam and Eve failed to worship God rightly. They did not respond with faith and obedience to who God is and what he has gloriously done. And so have we. They offer and we offer what the songwriter Leonard Cohen refers to as a cold and broken hallelujah. Scene 1 ends with some foreshadowing of how the story is going to progress. God banishes Adam and Eve out of the perfect space that he had made for them in the garden. God clothes Adam and Eve with the skins of an animal, hinting at the role that substitution and sacrifice and covering are going to play later on in our story. Now, if this were the entire story, it would be a tragedy. My oldest son is in high school, and right now he is in a literature class, and he just finished reading Shakespeare's Hamlet. And just last week, I came home and I was talking to him, and he was just shocked. I mean, his whole life, all of the stories that he reads have these wonderfully happy endings. It's usually the knight slays the dragon, the prince marries the princess, all of these people live happily ever after. And he said, "Dad, at the end of Hamlet, everyone dies." And it's a tragedy. At the end of Hamlet, everyone dies. And at the end of scene 1, everyone dies. In Genesis, all of these genealogies of Adam, who had Seth, and then he died. And Seth had Enoch, and then he died. And then he died. It is a grim and gruesome reminder of the penalty of not responding rightly to a worthy God. The wages of sin is death. And this scene is a tragedy. If this scene were the entire story, this story would be a tragedy. But this is not the entire story. This is just a scene. Let's move to scene 2.